Hello, my name is Jane. Welcome to Sleep Stories World. Close your eyes and let the warm Pacific carry you away. Tonight's sleep story takes you on a gentle, deeply researched journey through one of the most extraordinary places on Earth, Fiji. From the ancient coral gardens glowing beneath the surface of the sea, to the villages where a single word means life and strangers say it to each other all day long, this is 1.5 hours of soothing, atmospheric storytelling crafted specifically to help your mind unwind, your body relax, and sleep find you naturally. This is not fiction. Every detail is real, woven into a flowing, unhurried narrative that moves through Fiji's ancient human story, its extraordinary natural world, its complex and beautiful history, and its outer islands where the world goes very, very quiet. Told at the gentle pace your mind needs to finally, completely let go. But first, let's prepare your space for rest. Ensure you're somewhere comfortably cool, dark, and quiet. If you need to adjust anything, your curtains, your temperature, your pillows, please do so now. When you're ready, lie down and let yourself settle into your bed. Feel the weight of your body being supported. You may want to cover yourself with a light blanket as your body relaxes. Now, gently close your eyes. There's nothing you need to see anymore tonight. Your only task now is to be here, allowing yourself to receive the gift of rest. Take a deep breath in through your nose. And exhale slowly through your mouth. Breathe in deeply, feeling your chest expand. Breathe out, feeling your body sink deeper into your bed. In. And out. With each breath, you're signaling to your body that it's safe to rest. Now, imagine being surrounded by a warm, vibrant light. This light is gentle and comforting, carrying with it a deep sense of peace and safety. As you breathe in, let this warm light fill your chest. As you breathe out, imagine it spreading gently through your upper body. Breathe in, and let the light expand through your shoulders, your arms, your back. Breathe out, and feel it filling your stomach, your neck, your head, every space within you glowing softly. If a thought comes by, acknowledge it like watching a leaf float by on a gentle stream, and then let it drift away. There will be time for those thoughts later. Now is for rest. On your next breath in, let the warm light travel downward. Feel it reach your hips, your thighs, your knees. Breathe out, and sense it flowing down to your ankles, to your toes. Every part of you now is surrounded by this gentle, warm glow. You are completely enveloped in comfort and peace. Focus on your breath and the warm light surrounding you. If your mind wanders, simply guide it back, gently, to your breath, to the light. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are exactly where you need to be. As we move into tonight's story, allow yourself to let go even more. Let the words wash over you like a gentle tide. You don't need to follow every detail. Simply receive the story as a gift, a soft companion as you journey toward sleep. And now, let us begin. We are going somewhere warm tonight. Somewhere the air smells of salt and rain and something sweet and green that doesn't quite have a name. Somewhere the ocean doesn't rush but simply moves, long and slow and endlessly patient, the way it has always moved, long before any of us were here to watch it. We are going to Fiji. And as we begin, there is nothing you need to do. Only listen. Only let the images form, soft and unhurried, like light moving through water. Imagine, for a moment, that you are looking down from very high above the earth. The way a bird might look down, if a bird could fly high enough to see the whole spread of the Pacific beneath it. You would see ocean. Mostly ocean. More ocean than your eyes could take in all at once. An impossible blue, stretching in every direction, vast and still and ancient. And then, in the middle of all that blue, you would begin to see shapes. Small at first, just darker patches beneath the surface, hints of something solid beneath all that water. But as you descended a little lower, as the light caught things differently, those shapes would become islands. Dozens of them. Scores of them. Scattered across the water like something that had been gently placed there by a careful hand. Not dropped, not thrown, but arranged, almost tenderly, across the face of the sea. This is Fiji. An archipelago of 333 islands, rising from the South Pacific Ocean, sitting roughly 3,000 kilometers northeast of New Zealand. 333 islands, though that number has always felt slightly magical, as though whoever was counting simply decided it was the right number to stop at. Of those 333 islands, only around 110 are inhabited. The rest belong to the birds, the crabs, the wind, and the slow green creep of vegetation that quietly covers everything left alone long enough. Many of them are little more than a ring of coral and a few swaying palms, their beaches unmarked by footprints, their lagoons never touched by a single boat. Let that sink in for a moment, an entire island, with its own small beach, its own particular angle to the sunset, and no one there to see any of it. Sometimes the most beautiful things happen in complete and perfect privacy. Fiji straddles something remarkable on the map, the 180th meridian, the line where the calendar changes, where one day becomes the next. The international date line bends slightly around Fiji so that the whole archipelago shares the same date, but the simple fact remains: these islands sit at one of the most symbolically significant coordinates on Earth. Stand in the right place in Fiji and you are standing, in a sense, at the hinge of time itself. Yesterday and tomorrow curled around each other like two quiet tides. It is the kind of thing that makes a place feel a little outside of ordinary time. And perhaps that is part of what you feel when you arrive in Fiji, that the usual pace of things doesn't quite apply here. That clocks are running, yes, but very gently, very quietly. The two great islands of the archipelago are called Viti Levu and Vanua Levu. Between them, they make up nearly all of Fiji's land, roughly 87% of it. Viti Levu is the largest, and it is here that most of Fijian life is rooted. The capital city of Suva sits on its southeastern coast, facing the sea with a certain quiet authority. Vanua Levu lies to the north, a little wilder, a little less visited, its interior thick with forest and its coastline cut by deep and winding bays. But Fiji's land tells only part of the story. The true extent of this place is measured in water, not soil. Fiji's exclusive economic zone, the ocean it watches over, the sea that belongs to it, covers approximately 1.3 million square kilometers. You could fit the entire landmass of Fiji into that ocean zone 70 times over, and still have room left. Fiji is, in every meaningful sense, more ocean than land. And the ocean is not empty. It is full, extraordinarily, astonishingly full of life. The islands themselves were born from fire. From deep beneath the Pacific floor, over millions of years, volcanic activity pushed and folded and lifted the earth until these islands broke the surface and held. Fiji remains one of the most geologically complex archipelagos in the entire Pacific. Layers of ancient lava compressed into stone, coral reefs building themselves patiently over the volcanic foundations, the land and the sea always in a slow and quiet negotiation with each other. If you were to walk inland on the big island of Viti Levu, away from the coast, away from the resort beaches, up through the sugarcane fields and into the hills, you would find yourself climbing towards something genuinely wild. The highest point on the island, and in all of Fiji, is a peak called Mount Tomanivi, which rises to 1,324 meters above sea level. Not a towering mountain by any global measure, but cloaked in dense, ancient tropical rainforest all the way to its crown. Cloud forest, some of it. The kind where the trees are wrapped in moss and ferns and the air is cool and green and you can hear the drip of moisture from leaf to leaf in the silence between bird calls. The name Tomanivi means, loosely, the chief of mountains. And there is something in the way it sits above the island, patient and forested and quietly dominant, that makes the name feel entirely right. Even the word Fiji carries a small piece of history inside it, if you listen carefully. The indigenous Fijian people have always called their homeland Viti. That is the name that came from within, the name the islands gave themselves. But when the first European explorers arrived, many of them came by way of Tonga, whose people were already sailing these waters long before the Europeans had found their way here. The Tongans pronounced Viti in their own way, closer to Fiji or Fiji. And the Europeans, hearing the Tongan version, carried that spelling home with them, and it became the name the world adopted. So the word Fiji is, in a sense, a name seen through another people's eyes. The islands as they were reflected in a neighboring culture, then passed on again. A name with a small echo of the old Pacific trade winds inside it, the centuries of ocean travel and human connection that wove these islands together long before the rest of the world took notice. But it is the sea around Fiji that holds perhaps the most extraordinary fact of all. Fiji sits on the outer boundary of a region scientists and marine biologists call the Coral Triangle, an area of the Pacific and Indian Oceans recognized as the most biologically diverse marine environment on the surface of the planet. And within its portion of that miraculous sea, Fiji's reefs are home to more than 1,500 species of marine life. Fish in colors that have no real names, only colors. Coral structures built over centuries into shapes that seem almost architectural, almost deliberate. Sea turtles that have been making the same slow circuits of the reef for longer than most of us have been alive. The reef does not sleep, exactly, but it has its own quiet hours, the deep blue of midnight when the current hushes and the fish tuck themselves into the coral and the whole underwater world settles into something close to stillness. It breathes, the reef, in and out. The water moving through it like breath moving through you now. There are 2 seasons in Fiji. From November to April, the warm wet season brings heavy rains and heat and a lushness that makes everything vibrantly, almost overwhelmingly green. The waterfalls run full. The rivers rise. The jungle climbs. But from May to October, the cooler dry season settles over the islands like a gentle hand. The air softens. The sky deepens to a blue that seems cleaner than ordinary blue. The trade winds move across the water at just the right temperature. Not cold, never cold, but refreshingly, perfectly cool. It is in this season that the islands seem most themselves, most at ease, as though they, too, have found their natural pace and are simply breathing in time with it. It is always this quiet season we imagine, when we imagine Fiji at night. So here we are, arrived, in our own gentle way, at the threshold of these islands. The ocean spreading around us in every direction, dark and warm and alive. The stars appearing one by one above the palm trees. The sound of the reef somewhere in the distance, that low, continuous murmur that becomes, after a little while, indistinguishable from silence itself. 333 islands. 110 of them with people, and fires at night, and the smell of cooking, and voices drifting over the water. The rest left quietly to themselves. There is so much more to discover here. The people who have called these islands home for 3,000 years. The reefs and their impossible colors. The old stories. The deep interior of the big island, where the forest holds its secrets close. The smaller islands, the ones with no name you'd recognize, the ones where the tide comes in each morning and the hermit crabs move in their small deliberate way across the warm sand. But there is no hurry tonight. We will move gently through all of it, one quiet thing at a time. Let your eyes grow heavy now. Let the image of that long, dark, starlit ocean settle around you like a blanket. Fiji is here. The water is warm. The reef is breathing. And so are you. Rest softly now as we move deeper into these islands, deeper into their ancient story, deeper into the green heart of a place that has always known how to be still. The ocean around us is still and dark and warm. Somewhere beyond the edge of what we can see, the reef continues its slow, perpetual breathing, that soft, distant murmur that has been there all along, underneath everything, patient as the tide itself. Let your body sink a little deeper now. Whatever you are carrying today, you can set it down. It will still be there tomorrow if you need it. But tonight, you don't need any of it. Tonight we go further in. Past the shoreline, past the coconut palms leaning their long shadows across the sand, and back, much further back, into the deep story of these islands. Because Fiji is not just a place of natural beauty, it is a place of immense human depth, of thousands of years of life, and language, and fire, and ceremony, and song. And to understand Fiji as it is today, we need to begin at the very beginning. 3,500 years ago, the Pacific Ocean was a different kind of world. There were no maps of it, no charts, no instruments to measure longitude or calculate position across those vast and featureless stretches of open water. And yet people were crossing it in canoes, extraordinary ocean-going vessels, sailed by extraordinary navigators who read the stars and the swells and the behavior of birds with a precision that modern science has only recently begun to fully appreciate. These were the Lapita people, and they are the first humans we know of to have made their home in what we now call Fiji. They came from the west, from the region of the Bismarck Archipelago, in what is now Papua New Guinea, moving eastward across the Pacific in a slow migration that unfolded over generations. They were settlers in the truest sense, carrying with them not just their tools and their seeds, but their culture, their ceremonies, their way of understanding the world. Wherever the Lapita people went, they left something of themselves behind, and the most distinctive thing they left was their pottery. Lapita pottery is unmistakable. Geometric patterns pressed and incised into clay with extraordinary care, fine lines, repeated shapes, complex grids, and curves that speak of a people with a highly developed sense of design and a highly developed sense of identity. When archaeologists began finding shards of this pottery across the Pacific, in Vanuatu, in Tonga, in Samoa, and here in Fiji, particularly on the island of Viti Levu, they began to understand the shape of that ancient migration. A people leaving traces of themselves across thousands of kilometers of open ocean, like breadcrumbs made of fired clay. Imagine them arriving. The canoes coming through the reef passage as the light changed in the afternoon, the green hills of Viti Levu rising above them, birds calling from the tree line, the smell of the island, soil and vegetation and fresh water, reaching them before they even touched the shore. The first footprints in Fijian sand. The first fire lit on a Fijian beach. 3,500 years ago. But the story of Fijian people did not stop with the Lapita arrival. Centuries later, a second great wave of migration swept into the islands. Melanesian peoples from the west, darker in complexion, different in cultural tradition, moving into a world that the Lapita descendants had already been shaping for generations. The two peoples met and mixed, and over long centuries of intermarriage and cultural exchange, they became something new, something distinct. The Fijian people as we know them, with their own language, their own traditions, their own particular way of being in the world, emerged from that long and complex blending. Not one people's story, but two, woven together so thoroughly over so many generations that the seam between them is no longer visible. It is one of the oldest stories in human history, repeated across every continent. People arriving, meeting, mixing, and gradually, gently, becoming one people with a shared identity. It always takes time, but it always happens. The society that emerged from those thousands of years of island life was intricate and deeply rooted. At its heart was the Yavusa, the clan. Every Fijian belonged to a Yavusa, a kinship group that traced its ancestry back to a single founding ancestor, a figure from the deep past around whom the whole family tree was organized. Your Yavusa was not simply your family, it was your identity, your place in the world, your obligations, your rights, your story. And the Yavusa lived together in villages, villages that were not just practical arrangements of houses, but social and spiritual organisms. The layout of a traditional Fijian village was never accidental. The position of each family's home, the location of the meeting house, the orientation toward the chief's compound, all of it expressed a social order that had been refined over centuries. Walk into a traditional Fijian village today and you are walking into a living map of something ancient. The land itself remembers who everyone is. The houses within those villages, the traditional dwellings called bure, were marvels of practical design. Thatched with dried grass or palm fronds, their rooflines high and steeply pitched, designed with an intimate understanding of the climate they had to withstand. When the heavy tropical rains came, and they came hard, and they came often, the steep pitch of the bure roof threw the water clear of the walls and the foundation, keeping the interior dry and surprisingly cool. The woven walls allowed air to circulate. The whole structure worked with the environment rather than against it, the way the best human buildings always do. Inside, in the dim, cool interior, the floor covered with woven mats, the family gathered. And at the center of that gathering, more often than not, was a bowl. The bowl was for kava. If there is a single substance, a single ritual, that runs like a golden thread through the entire history of Fijian social and spiritual life, it is kava. Made from the dried and ground root of a pepper plant, Piper methisticum, a plant native to the Pacific, Kava produces a drink that is earthy and slightly bitter, that numbs the tongue gently as you drink it, and that brings a calm, clear, unhurried feeling that Fijians have valued for thousands of years. But kava is not merely a drink. It is ceremony. The Yakona ceremony, as the kava ritual is known in Fiji, is the most important social ritual in Fijian life. No significant meeting begins without it. No visitor of importance is welcomed without it. No negotiation, no reconciliation, no formal gathering of any kind proceeds without the kava bowl being prepared, blessed, and shared. The preparation is precise and deliberate. The grinding, the mixing with water, the straining through cloth, the filling of the tanoa, the great wooden communal bowl. The serving follows a careful order of precedence, the highest in status served first, the bowl offered and accepted with specific words and gestures that have been passed down unchanged through generations. When you sit in a Yakona ceremony, and visitors to Fiji are often invited to do so, you are sitting inside something very old. Older than the colonial era. Older than the arrival of Christianity. Older than the first European ship that ever sighted these islands. You are sitting inside a ritual that these islands invented for themselves, long before the outside world arrived. There is something deeply restful about that. About a tradition so old and so continuous that it has outlasted everything that tried to change it, simply by being too essential to abandon. Because Fiji was not, by the standards of the outside world, always a peaceful place. By the time European explorers and traders began arriving in any number in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Fiji had developed a fearsome reputation across the Pacific. The islands were known among sailors as the Cannibal Isles, a name spoken with genuine unease around the fires of ships anchored in safer harbors. Intertribal warfare was a constant feature of Fijian life, and the ritual consumption of defeated enemies, deeply confronting to Western eyes, was practiced in a specific spiritual context, rooted in the belief that consuming an enemy absorbed their power and completed their defeat in a way that mere killing could not. It was a world of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary violence, existing side by side. As so much of human history has been. Into this world, in the middle of the 19th century, rose one of the most remarkable figures in Pacific history. His name was Ratu Seru Ebenezer Kakabau, and he was a chief of extraordinary ambition and capability. Through warfare, alliance, and political intelligence, Kakabau gradually extended his influence across Fiji until he was recognized, at least in the eyes of the European powers, as something close to a paramount chief, a king of all Fiji. But Kakabau's story is not simply one of conquest. It is a story of transformation. In 1854, after years of resisting the influence of Wesleyan missionaries who had been making their way through the Pacific, Kakabau converted to Christianity. The conversion was, by any account, both sincere and politically calculated, but its effects were profound. Kakabau renounced cannibalism. He began to reshape the social fabric of the islands he controlled. And in 1874, facing a situation of considerable political and financial complexity, mounting debts to American interests, internal conflict among the chiefs, the growing pressure of foreign interference, Kakabau made the decision that would define Fiji's future. He ceded the islands to the British Crown. It was not a decision made from weakness, though it might look that way from the outside. It was a decision made with the pragmatic intelligence of a man who understood that the world was changing faster than any Fijian chief could control, and that the best way to protect his people was to enter the new order on his own terms, rather than be overrun by it. He placed Fiji in British hands, and in doing so, he bought his people something: a degree of protection, a framework, a continuity. The British flag was raised over Fiji on the 10th of October, 1874. And the islands entered a new chapter, one that brought enormous change, and considerable suffering, and complicated legacies that are still being worked through today. And yet, through all of it, through colonization and the importation of indentured Indian laborers to work the sugarcane fields, through the reconfiguration of land and law and governance, through independence in 1970 and the political turbulences that followed, through all of it, something in Fijian culture proved remarkably, quietly durable. It is called karakia. The concept is simple enough to describe, but profound in its implications. Karakia is the practice of communal sharing, a social custom so deeply embedded in Fijian life that it operates almost as instinct. If you need something, and someone else has it, you may ask for it. And the expectation, not merely the hope, but the social expectation, is that it will be given. Refusal is not simply unkind. In the traditional framework, refusal is a kind of social violation, a tearing of the communal fabric. In a world built on karakia, you do not accumulate quietly while your neighbor goes without. You share what you have, because you are not, in the deepest sense, separate from your neighbor. You are part of the same thing, the same yavusa, the same village, the same island. Modernity has complicated karakia, as modernity complicates everything, and there are Fijians today who will tell you that the custom can be burdensome, that it can make the accumulation of personal wealth difficult, that it sits in uneasy tension with the individualism that the global economy demands. That is true, but it is also still there, still practiced, still shaping the way Fijian people move through the world and relate to each other. And perhaps that is why the famous, genuine warmth of Fijian hospitality, the thing that every visitor notices, the thing that gives the islands their nickname, the Friendly Isles, the Isles of Smiles, perhaps that warmth is not simply a matter of national temperament. Perhaps it is the living residue of 3,500 years of karakia, of a culture that decided, long ago, in the ancient time, that the right response to another human being is openness, is generosity, is welcome. The trade winds are moving very gently now, somewhere above the palm fronds. The village is quiet. The kava bowl has been put away for the night. Somewhere in the darkness, the sound of a single voice, not words, just a melody, drifts across the water and dissolves into the sound of the reef. 3,500 years of human life on these islands. Laughter and war and ceremony and loss and extraordinary, enduring beauty. And through it all, the same warm Pacific night, the same stars, the same sound of the water finding the shore. Let that long, deep human story settle around you like the night air, warm and ancient and full of a quiet dignity. There is more ahead. The Europeans are coming now, their tall ships moving toward the horizon, their charts almost empty where Fiji should be. And when they arrive, everything will change, and everything will also, somehow, stay the same. Rest now. Let the next tide carry us gently forward. The night is very still now. Feel the weight of your body, the gentle, heavy warmth of it, and let yourself sink a little further into rest. There is nothing to solve tonight, nothing to prepare for. The only thing asked of you, in this moment, is to breathe. In, slowly, and out, slowly, and to let the images come, soft and unhurried, the way they always do when we stop trying to make them. We left our story in the village, in the warm interior of the islands, where the kava bowl had been put away and a single voice was carrying a melody across the water. 3,500 years of human life on these islands, held gently in the dark. But on the horizon, something was changing. Far to the west, and then the north, and then from every direction at once, sails were appearing. Tall ships. Strange ships. Ships unlike anything the people of these islands had ever seen, carrying men with different skin and different tools and different gods, men who looked at the world through charts and compasses and ledgers, men who were mapping everything they found and trying to fit it into a story they already knew. The Europeans were coming to Fiji, and nothing, after that, would ever be quite the same. The first of them came and went like a shadow. His name was Abel Tasman, a Dutch navigator of considerable skill and considerable courage, sailing in the service of the Dutch East India Company in an era when the Pacific was still largely a mystery to European eyes. In 1643, on his second great voyage of Pacific exploration, Tasman's ships moved through the northern reaches of what would one day be called the Fijian archipelago. He saw the islands, their green shapes rising from the sea, the white lines of surf breaking across the reefs that guarded them. But he did not land. The reefs were too dangerous, a labyrinth of coral that his pilots could not safely navigate without local knowledge, and local knowledge was the one thing Tasman did not have. So he noted what he saw, recorded the approximate positions, and sailed on. A glimpse, and then gone. The islands watching the Dutch ship move away across the horizon, unaware of the history they had almost begun. It would be another 130 years before the next significant European contact. In 1774, Captain James Cook, already one of the most accomplished navigators in European history, already a veteran of one complete circumnavigation of the globe, was making his second great voyage into the Pacific. He was pushing further south than anyone had gone before, searching for the great southern continent that European geographers were convinced must exist. On his way back north, his ships passed through the southern reaches of the Fijian group. Cook saw the islands too. He noted them. He named some of them in his journals. But like Tasman before him, he did not land on the main islands. The reefs, again, were the obstacle, and Cook, who had already lost one ship on the Great Barrier Reef and had no desire to lose another, kept his distance. These great navigators circled Fiji like careful birds, noting its existence, marking its rough position on their charts, and moving on. The islands remained, in European imagination, a place on the edge of things, seen but not yet known. But then came Bligh. William Bligh is one of the most famous, and most misunderstood, figures in Pacific history. Most people know his name from the mutiny on the Bounty, the story of how his crew, led by Fletcher Christian, seized the ship in the waters near Tonga in April 1789 and cast Bligh adrift in the Pacific with 18 loyal men, a small open boat, minimal provisions, and no charts beyond what he could reconstruct from memory. What happened next is one of the most astonishing feats of navigation in human history. Bligh, in that small open boat, with 18 men and the most basic of instruments, sailed nearly 7,000 kilometers across open ocean to reach the island of Timor, all while keeping meticulous records of everything he passed. And he passed through Fiji. His boat moved through the Fijian reefs in May of 1789, the men exhausted and hungry, the tensions of their situation pressing down on all of them. And Fijian war canoes came out to meet them, not with welcome, with pursuit. The canoes were fast and the open boat was not, and for a time the situation was genuinely dangerous. But the canoes eventually turned back, and Bligh, characteristically, used the encounter productively. He recorded the positions of the islands, the nature of the reefs, the direction of the currents, with a precision that turned out to be remarkable. He returned to Fiji in 1792 on a second breadfruit voyage, filling in more detail. The charts he produced of Fijian waters were used by mariners for decades afterward. It is a peculiar kind of legacy, to be cast adrift in one of the most terrifying situations imaginable, and to respond by taking careful navigational notes. But Bligh was, whatever else he may have been, a genuinely extraordinary navigator. And Fiji's place in the European cartographic record was, in no small part, his work. After the navigators came the traders. The first wave arrived around 1804, drawn by a discovery that transformed Fiji's relationship with the outside world almost overnight: sandalwood. Sandalwood is a fragrant timber, its oil and its heartwood carrying a warm, sweet, woody scent that has been prized for centuries in Asia, particularly in China, where it was burned as incense and carved into objects of great value. When traders working the Pacific discovered that Fiji's interior forests contained stands of sandalwood, the rush began. Ships arrived from Sydney and Calcutta and Canton, anchoring off the Fijian coast while their crews and local traders worked the forests, cutting and transporting the timber to the shore. The trade was intense and relatively brief. Within roughly a decade, the sandalwood had been largely stripped from the accessible forests. The traders moved on, but they left things behind. Muskets, which changed the dynamics of Fijian warfare in ways that could not be undone. And disease, invisible and devastating, moving through a population that had no immunity to the illnesses of the outside world. When the sandalwood was gone, the traders found something else. On the floors of Fiji's lagoons and reefs, in the clear warm shallows, lived creatures that the Chinese market valued almost as highly as sandalwood: bêche-de-mer, sea cucumbers. Strange, soft, cylindrical animals that moved slowly across the reef floor, filtering the water, living their unhurried lives in the shallows. In Chinese cuisine they were considered a delicacy of the highest order, and the demand from Canton was essentially insatiable. From the 1820s onward, the bêche-de-mer trade brought a new and more sustained wave of Europeans to Fiji. This was not the quick slash-and-run of the sandalwood era. Processing bêche-de-mer required shore-based operations. The sea cucumbers had to be dried and smoked, a process that took time and infrastructure. European traders built semi-permanent stations on the Fijian coast. They negotiated with local chiefs for land and labor and protection. They stayed. Some of them stayed so long, or arrived so permanently in the form of shipwrecked sailors, that they entered Fijian life in a more intimate way. These were the beachcombers, men who, by circumstance or choice, had left the European world behind and were living among the Fijian people. Some were rough and dangerous. Some adapted with surprising sensitivity to the culture they found themselves in. A few became trusted advisors to powerful chiefs, their knowledge of European weapons and tactics making them valuable players in the intertribal politics of the era. One such figure was a Swede named Charlie Savage, who arrived in Fiji following a shipwreck around 1808 and became a fearsome fighter in the service of a Fijian chief, his musket giving his patron's forces a devastating advantage over enemies armed only with traditional weapons. Men like Savage changed the balance of power in Fiji in ways that rippled forward through decades of subsequent history. They are a strange and shadowy chapter, these European men who stepped sideways out of their own world and disappeared into another one. And then came the missionaries. From 1835, Wesleyan Methodist missionaries, many of them coming by way of Tonga, where Christianity had already taken deep root, began arriving in Fiji with a very different kind of purpose. Not to trade, not to plunder, but to convert. Their task was neither simple nor quick. Fiji's reputation as the Cannibal Isles was not merely a sailor's rumor, and the missionaries who arrived on these shores knew the risks they were taking with considerable clarity. Some of them paid dearly for it. But they came, and they stayed, and they worked, patiently, persistently, learning the language, building relationships with chiefs, translating the scriptures into Fijian. The conversion of Kakabau in 1854, the paramount chief whose influence spread across much of the islands, was the turning point. When the most powerful man in Fiji embraced Christianity, the social permission for others to follow was granted. The faith spread rapidly after that, moving along the same kinship networks and chiefly hierarchies that had always carried cultural change through Fijian society. Today, approximately 65% of indigenous Fijians identify as Christian, most of them Methodist. And Sunday in a Fijian village is still, genuinely and unmistakably, Sunday. The churches are full. The singing carries across the water, those extraordinary Fijian harmonies, voices woven together in a way that makes even the most secular of listeners stop and simply stand still for a moment. It is one of the stranger, more poignant ironies of Pacific history. A tradition imported by outsiders, embraced and then so thoroughly remade in Fijian terms that it became one of the most authentically Fijian things there is. But the European arrival carried something else with it. Something no one intended, and no one could stop. Disease. The Fijian people, like Pacific Islanders everywhere, had evolved in relative isolation from the great pools of infectious illness that had been circulating through the connected populations of Europe and Asia for centuries. They had no immunity, and when European diseases arrived, measles, influenza, dysentery, the results were catastrophic beyond any easy description. The worst single moment came in 1875, just 1 year after Fiji's formal annexation as a British Crown colony. A measles epidemic, introduced by a delegation of Fijian chiefs who had traveled to Sydney and returned infected, swept through the islands with terrifying speed. In a matter of months, approximately 1/3 of Fiji's entire population was dead. 1/3. Let that number settle for a moment in the quiet. Villages emptied. Families lost 3 generations in a single season. The social fabric of communities that had endured for thousands of years was torn in ways that took generations to begin to mend. It is the shadow that falls across all of this beauty, the thing that cannot be spoken around or softened into something easier to hold. The European arrival brought trade and Christianity and eventual political stability, and it brought this. Both things are true. Both things must be remembered. And yet, in the midst of all of this complexity, the formal transfer of sovereignty over the Fijian Islands to the British Crown was, by the standards of the colonial era, an act of genuine agency on the part of the Fijian leadership. On the 10th of October, 1874, Ratu Seru Kakabau and a group of leading Fijian chiefs gathered and signed the deed of cession. The document transferring governance of the islands to Queen Victoria was marked with their own hands, in their own names. Kakabau had considered the decision carefully, over years. He had seen what uncontrolled European contact was doing to his islands. He had seen the debt, the instability, the spiral of musket warfare that European weapons had enabled. He had calculated, with the intelligence of a man who had spent a lifetime navigating impossible political terrain, that British governance offered his people better protection than the alternative. He was not wrong in all of his calculations. The British did provide a framework of governance and, eventually, a measure of stability. They also, in the very next year, unleashed the measles epidemic through the carelessness of that delegation to Sydney. History is never simple. Its gifts and its wounds almost always arrive together. The stars are very bright tonight. Somewhere in a Fijian village, if you listen very carefully past the sound of the reef, you might just hear it, that unmistakable sound of Fijian voices in harmony. A hymn, perhaps, or an old song that was old before the missionaries arrived and is still being sung now, the melody unchanged, the meaning carried forward by the simple human act of one generation teaching it to the next. 3,500 years of people on these islands. And now, led into that ancient story, all of this, the Dutch navigator who glimpsed and sailed on, the Bligh and his open boat in the dark, the sandalwood traders and the sea cucumber fires on the beach, the missionaries with their hymn books, the devastating silence of the epidemic year, and through all of it, the islands themselves, patient, green, surrounded by their reef, enduring. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight of all that history settle gently around you, like sediment drifting to the floor of a calm lagoon. Not heavy, just present, just real. The story is moving forward now, out of the colonial era and into something new, the extraordinary, complicated, beautiful mosaic of modern Fiji, where cultures that arrived from opposite ends of the earth have been learning, for 150 years, how to share a home. And the reef, all the while, growing patiently beneath the surface, one coral polyp at a time. Let the tide carry you softly into the next chapter. Rest now. Rest. Rest a little deeper now. Feel the breath moving in and out, slow and easy, and let the images form at their own pace, the way they do in the space between waking and sleep. That soft, unhurried place where the mind opens like a hand releasing something it has been holding too tightly. We are still in Fiji. We are always still in Fiji tonight. The colonial era has settled over the islands now, the British flag raised, the new administrative machinery beginning its slow work, the reefs and the forests and the villages continuing their ancient rhythms underneath all of it. But something else is coming. Something that will change the human story of these islands as profoundly as anything that has come before. It is coming from a great distance, from a subcontinent half a world away, carried across the Indian Ocean and the Coral Sea in the holds of ships. Coming not as explorers, not as traders, not as missionaries. Coming as workers, as laborers, as people who, in many cases, had very little choice. Their arrival would make Fiji something no other Pacific nation quite became, a place where two ancient, completely distinct human civilizations would find themselves sharing a small cluster of islands in the middle of the ocean, and would have to learn, over long and often painful decades, what it meant to be neighbors. The sugarcane came first. After annexation in 1874, the British colonial administration faced a practical problem. Fiji's land was extraordinarily fertile, particularly the broad river deltas and coastal plains of Viti Levu, where the soil was deep and the rainfall generous and the conditions almost perfectly suited to the cultivation of sugarcane. Sugarcane meant sugar, and sugar meant money, and the colonial administration needed money to function and to justify its existence to London. But there was a difficulty. The indigenous Fijian people were not, by disposition or tradition, plantation laborers. They had their own land, their own food systems, their own social obligations and seasonal rhythms. They were not unwilling to work, but they were unwilling to be bound to the kind of relentless, repetitive, industrial labor that a sugarcane plantation demanded. And the British colonial administration, having made commitments to protect Fijian land and Fijian custom as part of the deed of cession, was in no position to simply compel them. So they looked elsewhere. They looked to India. The system they employed was called indenture, and it was, in the careful language of colonial bureaucracy, dressed up as a voluntary labor agreement. Workers would sign a contract, a gurmit, the word derived from the English agreement, softened and reshaped by Indian tongues into something that sounded almost gentle. They would work for 5 years. They would be housed and fed. And at the end of their contract, they would have choices. Between 1879 and 1916, approximately 60,000 men and women boarded ships in the ports of Calcutta and Madras, carrying almost nothing, and crossed 2 oceans to a place most of them had never heard of and could not have found on a map. They came from the United Provinces and Bihar in the north, from among the poorest and most marginalized communities of the subcontinent. They came from Madras in the south, Tamil and Telugu speakers who shared neither language nor custom with their northern shipmates. Many had been deceived about the distance involved, the conditions they would face, the nature of the work waiting for them. They were the Gurmitias. And their story is one of the most remarkable chapters in the entire human history of the Pacific. The ships that carried them were not comfortable. The crossing took weeks. People from entirely different regions of India, different castes, different languages, different religions, different foods, different gods, found themselves crowded together in the same holds, dependent on each other for survival, the old hierarchies of caste and region suddenly meaningless in the face of shared circumstance. Something remarkable happened in that enforced closeness. The rigid social structures that had defined everyone's identity back home began, slowly, to dissolve. A Brahmin from Bihar and an untouchable from Madras were equally lost, equally far from home, equally dependent on the person next to them. The ocean, in its indifference to human hierarchy, was inadvertently doing something radical. When they arrived in Fiji, the dissolution continued. Workers were housed in lines, long barracks, originally designed for the transportation of enslaved people, repurposed with a certain colonial efficiency for their new inhabitants. The conditions were harsh by any honest measure. The work was physically brutal, cutting cane in tropical heat, the sharp edges of the cane leaves cutting the skin, the mills running without regard for exhaustion or illness. The penal clause of the indenture contract meant that workers who refused to work, or who were deemed to have violated their agreement, could be prosecuted and imprisoned. The power differential between the plantation owners and the workers was absolute. And yet, out of those barracks, out of those cane fields, out of that shared hardship, something extraordinary grew. The Gurmitias were creating a new culture. With their original languages scrambled together across so many regional dialects, the workers began developing something new, a lingua franca, a shared tongue that drew from multiple Hindi dialects, absorbed English words, bent itself around Fijian sounds, and became, over generations, a distinct language in its own right. Fiji Hindi. Not quite the Hindi of India, not quite anything else, its own living thing, carrying inside it the whole compressed history of the indenture experience. The longing, the adaptation, the extraordinary human capacity to make something new out of whatever is available. Their spiritual life underwent a similar transformation. Hindus and Muslims who back in India would have lived in largely separate communities found themselves neighbors, sharing the same difficult circumstances. The strict observances of caste became impossible to maintain in the lines. New forms of worship emerged, more communal, more flexible, drawing from both traditions while belonging completely to neither one. Festivals that had been regional became universal. Stories that had belonged to one community became everyone's stories. The Gurmatias were not merely surviving. They were inventing themselves. When the indenture period ended, the system was abolished in 1916. The workers faced a choice. The colonial administration offered a free passage back to India, or a grant of land in Fiji equivalent to what they had worked. It was not a generous offer, and India, for many of them, was a place they had left so long ago that it had become almost abstract. A memory, a smell, a set of stories told to children who had been born here, on this island, under these particular stars. Many stayed. Most stayed. And their decision to stay transformed Fiji permanently. Their descendants, the Indo-Fijians, built communities, opened businesses, established schools. They became teachers and doctors and lawyers and merchants. They worked the cane farms on leased land, generation after generation, their labor making sugar the backbone of Fiji's economy for most of the 20th century. At the industry's peak, Fiji was producing sugar for markets across the world, and the narrow-gauge railway lines that carried the bundled cane from the fields to the mills, winding through the flat green landscape of western Viti Levu like something from a quieter century, became one of the most distinctive and quietly beautiful features of the Fijian countryside. Imagine it in the early morning light. The cane fields still holding the last of the night's coolness, the dew on the broad leaves catching the first sun, the small train moving slowly along its narrow track through the green, the smell of cut cane sweet and sharp in the air. Workers in the fields, their voices carrying across the flat land. The mill in the distance, already beginning its day. It is a scene that, for 100 years, was as Fijian as anything on the islands. But underneath the productivity and the community building, a tension was quietly accumulating. And it had its roots in land. When the British annexed Fiji, they had made a solemn commitment. Indigenous Fijian land would be protected. It could not be sold. It could be leased to Indo-Fijian farmers, to European businesses, but the ownership would always remain with the Fijian clans, the Matakali, the ancient landholding units whose connection to specific pieces of ground went back to the first settlers 3,500 years ago. This arrangement had a certain protective logic to it, but it also created a permanent structural inequality. Indo-Fijian farmers could lease land, but they could never own it. Their security was always contingent, always subject to the decisions of landowners who were, by law and by history, always going to be someone else. And as the Indo-Fijian population grew, at times approaching near parity with the indigenous Fijian population, the political implications of this arrangement became increasingly complex. By the 1980s, Indo-Fijians had become a formidable presence in Fijian professional and commercial life. In the 1987 elections, a coalition with strong Indo-Fijian support won government. And 1 month later, a Fijian army officer named Sitiveni Rabuka walked into parliament with armed soldiers and seized power, Fiji's first military coup, justified in terms of protecting indigenous Fijian political supremacy. It was a moment of profound fracture. And it was followed by another coup later in 1987, and further political turbulences in the decades that followed. The constitution was rewritten. Land lease arrangements were tightened. And Indo-Fijians, reading the message written in those events with painful clarity, began to leave. The emigration that followed was quiet and steady and enormous in its cumulative effect. Doctors, teachers, accountants, engineers, the professionally skilled, the educated, the people who had built their lives around a belief that Fiji was their home, packed what they could and moved to Australia, to New Zealand, to Canada, to the United States. Not all at once. Family by family, year by year, a slow hemorrhage of people and talent and memory. The Indo-Fijian share of the population, which had once approached 50%, fell to roughly 37%. Whole communities thinned. Temples sat less full. Cane farms that had been worked by the same family for 3 and 4 generations were handed back as leases expired and were not renewed. It is a quietly heartbreaking chapter. People who had been brought to these islands against their ancestors' will, who had built their lives here over 5 generations, who had made this place genuinely their own, finding themselves, in the end, made to feel that it wasn't. And yet Fiji without its Indo-Fijian community is simply not Fiji. Walk through the streets of Suva or Nodi on any ordinary day and the evidence of that deep cultural weaving is everywhere. The curry houses, their smells drifting out onto the street, turmeric and cumin and something sweet frying in hot oil, sitting alongside the kava bars and the Fijian market stalls. The Hindu temples with their vivid colors and their intricate carvings, the sound of the evening puja drifting across a neighborhood that also contains a Methodist church and a mosque. The Diwali celebrations in October or November, when the towns are strung with lights and the night smells of incense and sweets and the small clay lamps are set out on every windowsill and doorstep, their flames reflected in the dark eyes of children who were born here, on this island, and know no other home. And the language, Fiji Hindi, that living, breathing creation of the indenture barracks, that language that was born from hardship and became something beautiful, still spoken in homes and markets and across the back fences of neighborhoods where grandmothers call to each other in a tongue that exists nowhere else on earth. This is what cultures do, given enough time and enough shared experience. They stop being separate things and become one complicated, layered, sometimes painful, always astonishing thing. Indo-Fijian is not Indian. It is not generically Fijian. It is its own complete identity, with its own food and its own music and its own way of telling a joke and its own way of grieving. Earned over 5 generations of living on these particular islands, under this particular sky. The night is very soft now. Somewhere in Suva, a lamp is burning in a temple courtyard, small and steady, its flame perfectly still in the windless air. Somewhere on the cane plain of western Viti Levu, a farmhouse is dark and quiet, the family long since asleep, the fields rustling very gently in the trade wind outside. 2 worlds that arrived on these shores from opposite ends of the earth. 2 peoples who did not choose each other, who were thrown together by the machinery of empire and the economics of sugar, and who have been working out what it means to share a home ever since. It has not always been peaceful. It has not always been fair. But it has produced something that is, in its own complicated way, genuinely beautiful. A culture that belongs to no other place in the world, and to no other history but its own. Let that thought settle gently as you breathe. We are moving now toward the reef. Toward the part of Fiji that has no politics, no colonial history, no complicated legacy, only color and silence, and a beauty so complete it asks nothing of you except to witness it. The coral gardens are waiting, and they are extraordinary beyond any easy description. Rest now. Breathe. Let the warm Pacific night carry you softly forward. Let your eyes close a little more deeply now. Feel the breath, slow and warm and entirely your own, moving in and out like the gentlest of tides. There is nothing sharp left in the day. Whatever edges the morning had, whatever tensions the afternoon carried, they have softened now into something smooth and distant. The way sounds soften when you hear them through water. Through water. That is where we are going now. Down, very gently, through the warm surface of the Pacific, into a world that most people never see, and that those who have seen it never quite forget. We are going into Fiji's reef. And I want you to imagine it slowly. Not all at once, slowly. The way the light changes as you descend. The way the colors deepen and shift. The way the sound of the surface world, the waves, the wind, the human noise, fades above you, replaced by something that isn't quite silence, but is the closest thing to it you will ever find. Here is something worth knowing, before we go any further. Fiji is not merely a beautiful reef destination among many beautiful reef destinations. Marine biologists, people who have spent their professional lives diving reefs on every continent, in every ocean, will tell you, with a consistency that amounts to consensus, that Fiji's reefs are unique. That there is something here that exists nowhere else. They call it the soft coral capital of the world. Soft corals are different from the hard corals you might picture when you think of a reef. The branching staghorns, the dome-shaped brain corals, the great plates and fans of calcium carbonate that form the physical architecture of the reef structure. Soft corals have no rigid skeleton. They are flexible, fluid, moving with the current in a way that makes them look more like flowers, or feathers, or something from a dream than like an animal. And they come in colors that seem to have been chosen by someone with an extravagant imagination. Purples so deep they are almost black, pinks that glow with an inner warmth, oranges and yellows and reds so saturated they seem to emit their own light in the dim blue of the deep water. Fiji has these soft corals in concentrations and varieties found nowhere else on the planet. On certain dives, particularly around the island of Tevuni, where the currents run strong and the nutrient-rich water feeds the reef with extraordinary generosity, you descend into what can only be described as a garden. Not a metaphorical garden. An actual garden, tended by the ocean itself over centuries, growing in 3 dimensions in every direction you look. But Fiji's most remarkable reef structure is one that most people, even those who love Fiji deeply, have never heard of. Along the northwestern coast of Vanuatu, Fiji's second largest island, wilder and less visited than Viti Levu, stretches a reef of staggering dimensions. Its Fijian name is Kakolevu, which translates, with characteristic Fijian directness, as simply the Great Reef. And great it is, approximately 200 kilometers long, making it the 3rd longest barrier reef in the world. After the Great Barrier Reef of Australia. After the Mesoamerican Reef of the Caribbean. The 3rd longest barrier reef in the world. And most people have never heard its name. There is something deeply wonderful about that. About a natural wonder of that magnitude existing in relative obscurity, its 200 kilometers of living reef going about their ancient business, filtering the water, sheltering the fish, building themselves slowly upward toward the light, without a great deal of human attention or tourist infrastructure. The Kakolevu is still largely the reef the ocean intended, still largely itself. Now, let us talk about what a reef actually is. Because there is a common misunderstanding, a forgivable one, that coral is a kind of rock or a kind of plant. Something inert. Something that simply exists, the way a cliff exists or a sandbar exists. It is not. Coral is an animal. Each coral structure, each branching arm, each rounded dome, each great spreading plate, is built by creatures called polyps. Tiny, soft-bodied animals, most of them no larger than a grain of rice, living inside the calcium carbonate skeletons they secrete around themselves. A single coral head, something the size of a large boulder, something you could sit on, may contain thousands of individual polyps, each one alive, each one feeding, each one contributing its infinitesimal fraction of calcium carbonate to the structure that will outlast it by centuries. The reef is not a backdrop. It is not a setting. It is a living community of almost unimaginable complexity, a city, in a sense, in which every surface is inhabited, every niche occupied, every current and temperature gradient exploited by something that has evolved specifically to live in exactly that microenvironment. And Fiji's version of this city is extraordinary in its population. More than 400 species of coral, hard and soft, have been recorded in Fijian waters. More than 1,500 species of fish. To give you a sense of the scale of that biodiversity, the entire Caribbean Sea, that vast and storied body of water, contains fewer than 70 coral species. Fiji, in its relatively small patch of the Pacific, has nearly 6 times that number. Imagine, now, that you are floating just above the surface of a Fijian reef at night. The water is very warm, skin temperature, or close to it. The stars above you are extraordinary, the Milky Way reflected in the dark water around you, so that you seem to be floating in the middle of space rather than on the surface of the ocean. And then something begins to happen beneath you. It begins as a faint luminescence, a milkiness in the water, deep below the surface, spreading outward from the reef in slow, drifting clouds. And then, as your eyes adjust, you begin to see them, tiny, translucent spheres rising through the water like snow falling in reverse. Thousands of them. Then millions. Then more than you can count or comprehend, the entire column of water between you and the reef floor filling with this slow, luminous upward drift. You are witnessing a coral spawning. It happens once a year, sometimes twice, on Fijian reefs. Triggered by the precise combination of water temperature and the lunar cycle, every coral colony on the reef releases its eggs and sperm simultaneously. Not approximately simultaneously. Simultaneously, as though a signal has been given that travels through the water and reaches every polyp at the same moment, the reef acting as a single coordinated organism rather than a collection of individual animals. The result is something that has no real parallel in the visible world. An underwater snowstorm in reverse. The milky, luminous water. The rising clouds of life. The beginning of the next generation of reef, set loose into the Pacific in a single extraordinary collective act. People who have witnessed a coral spawning will sometimes struggle to describe it. They reach for words and find that ordinary words are not quite equal to it. It is, they say, one of the most beautiful things they have ever seen. One of the most humbling. A reminder, if any were needed, that the most astonishing spectacles on this planet are not the ones that humans have made. The reef supports life far beyond its own coral communities. In Fiji's waters, moving through the blue with an unhurried grace that speaks of deep evolutionary time, are sea turtles. Green turtles and hawksbill turtles, both species globally endangered, both species finding in Fijian waters one of their most important remaining habitats in the entire Pacific. Sea turtles have been navigating the ocean for more than 100 million years. Let that number settle for a moment. 100 million years. They were here before the extinction of the dinosaurs. They have outlasted ice ages and asteroid impacts and the entire rise and fall of every human civilization that has ever existed. Their bodies are so perfectly suited to the ocean that they have not needed to change significantly in all that time. Evolution looked at the sea turtle and decided that nothing needed improving. To watch a sea turtle moving through a Fijian reef is to feel, very acutely, the particular sensation of being in the presence of something ancient. The way it moves, unhurried, weightless, turning its head to look at you with an eye that is calm and dark and carries no particular expression, induces a kind of stillness in the observer. You stop finning. You float. You watch. And for a little while, the ordinary pace of human time seems entirely beside the point. In the open water beyond the reef, in the blue passages between Fiji's outer islands and seamounts, something even larger moves. The manta ray, the largest ray species in the world, its wingspan reaching, in the largest individuals, up to 7 meters from tip to tip. An animal that moves through the water not by swimming in the way most fish swim, but by flying. That is the only word for it. The great triangular wings rising and falling in long, slow, powerful strokes, the animal banking and turning through the water with the effortless authority of something that has completely mastered its medium. Manta rays feed on plankton, microscopic organisms invisible to the naked eye, filtering enormous volumes of water through their open mouths as they glide. There is something deeply calming about the manta's relationship to its food source. No chase, no ambush, no sudden violence. Just a vast, gentle animal moving through the water with its mouth open, the ocean providing everything it needs. They are, for their size and their apparent simplicity, extraordinarily intelligent. They have the largest brain-to-body ratio of any cold-blooded vertebrate. They recognize themselves in mirrors, a capacity previously thought to be exclusive to primates, elephants, and dolphins. They visit cleaning stations on the reef regularly, hovering almost motionless while small fish remove parasites from their skin, appearing to derive something that looks, from the outside, remarkably like contentment from the experience. Fiji's waters are among the best places on Earth to encounter them. To float in the blue and watch a manta ray pass beneath you, that great shadow, those slow wing beats, the white markings on its underside like a map of somewhere, is to feel very small and very grateful, in equal measure. But the reef is not invulnerable. The warming of the world's oceans, driven by the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, is perhaps the single greatest threat the reef ecosystem has ever faced. When water temperatures rise above the threshold that corals have evolved to tolerate, the corals respond with a stress reaction that is as beautiful as it is devastating. They expel the microscopic algae, called zooxanthellae, that live within their tissues and provide them with up to 90% of their energy through photosynthesis. Without these algae, the coral loses its color entirely, turning a stark, ghostly white. Bleached. A bleached coral is not a dead coral. Not yet. It is a coral under extreme stress, surviving on its reserves, waiting for the water to cool. If the temperature drops in time, the algae can return, and the coral can recover. But if the heat persists, And in recent decades, across Fiji's reefs as across reefs everywhere, the heat has been persisting for longer and returning more frequently. The coral starves. And it dies. The reef that took 10,000 years to build can be reduced to white rubble in a single warm season. It is the shadow that falls across all of this beauty. The thing that those who love these reefs carry with them as they dive, the awareness that what they are seeing is under pressure, that the calendar of bleaching events is accelerating, that the window in which these coral gardens exist in their full extraordinary complexity may not be infinite. And yet Fiji has responded to this threat with something remarkable. Across the archipelago, in village after village, a conservation model has taken root that is as elegant in its design as anything the international environmental movement has produced. It is called the Locally Managed Marine Area, the LMMA, and its principle is beautifully simple. The reef, in Fijian traditional culture, has always belonged to the community whose land borders it. The fishing grounds were never open commons. They were, under traditional law, the responsibility of the village that had always worked them. The LMMA system takes that ancient principle and gives it a modern conservation framework. Each village designates specific areas of their reef as protected zones. No fishing, no harvesting, no disturbance. The village itself monitors and enforces the protection. The decision about which areas to protect, for how long, and under what conditions, is made by the community. The results have been extraordinary. Inside the protected areas, fish populations have rebounded. Coral cover has increased. The reef has begun, in places, to heal. And the knowledge that the reef is recovering, that their actions are working, has given communities a stake in the outcome that no externally imposed regulation could replicate. It is a model now being studied and replicated across the Pacific. An answer to a global problem that came not from a conference room or a government department, but from a Fijian fishing village applying a principle its ancestors understood 3,000 years ago, that if you take care of the sea will take care of you. The water is very warm and very still now. Somewhere below us, in the dark of the reef, the polyps are feeding, their tiny tentacles extended into the current, capturing the microscopic particles that drift past. A sea turtle is resting on a ledge of coral, its eyes closed, its great lungs slowly emptying and filling with the water breath of sleep. A manta ray is somewhere out in the blue passage, banking in a long, slow turn, its brain, that remarkable, oversized brain, processing something we will never fully understand. The reef breathes. The reef dreams. The reef builds itself, one calcium carbonate grain at a time, toward the surface and the light. Let your own breathing slow to match it. In, slowly. Out, slowly. The weight of your body perfectly supported. The warmth of the water all around you. We are moving upward now. Back through the shimmer of the surface. Back to the islands themselves, to the villages and the market days and the extraordinary sound that greets you everywhere you go in Fiji. The sound that gave these islands their other name. The sound of genuine, unperformed, irresistible human warmth. The people of Fiji are waiting. And they are smiling. Rest now, and let the current carry you gently to shore. You are back at the surface now. The warm Pacific air is on your face, and the sound of the reef is behind you, and ahead of you, not far, close enough that you can smell the green of it, the coconut palms and the warm earth and something cooking somewhere that you cannot quite identify but that makes you feel, inexplicably, at home. Ahead of you is the shore. Let your body be completely still now, completely supported. There is nothing to hold up, nothing to brace against. Just the warmth, and the sound of the water, and the shore growing gently closer. And then someone on the beach sees you, and they smile. Not a polite smile. Not a professional smile. A smile of such complete and uncomplicated genuineness that it stops you for a moment, catches you slightly off guard, the way real warmth always does when you haven't been expecting it. A smile that seems to say, "You are here, and that is a good thing, and I am glad." And then they call out to you, "Beulah, Beulah." It is the first word most visitors learn in Fiji, and it is the word they remember longest after they leave. Soft at the beginning, the B carrying a slight nasal quality, so that it sounds almost like Beulah, and warm in the middle, and open at the end. A word that rolls out of the mouth with a natural ease, as though it has always been there waiting. It means life. Not hello in the casual, almost empty way that hello has become in much of the modern world, a social reflex, a sound made to fill the space where an acknowledgement should be. Beulah is a statement of genuine intent. I see you. I recognize you as a living person, and I wish you life. In one small, soft syllable, the entire philosophy of Fijian hospitality is compressed and offered freely to anyone who crosses the threshold of these islands. You will hear it everywhere. From the woman selling vegetables in the Suva market, who will say it to you as naturally as breathing. From the child running along the road who will shout it at your passing car with delighted enthusiasm. From the old man sitting in the shade outside his house, who will say it quietly and with a dignity that makes it feel, for a moment, like a blessing. Beulah. And its fuller, more emphatic form, Beulah Vinaka, which adds the word for goodness, for beauty, for all things that are right with the world. Life and goodness. That is what they are wishing you. Every time. All day. To strangers and to friends, without distinction. The language that carries this greeting belongs to one of the oldest and most widely distributed language families on Earth. Fijian, known formally as Itauke, meaning, simply, of the land, is an Austronesian language. That places it in the same vast family as Tongan, Samoan, Hawaiian, Maori, Tagalog, Malay, and hundreds of other languages spread across a territory stretching from Madagascar in the west to Easter Island in the east. The most geographically extensive language family in human history, carried across the Pacific by those extraordinary Lapita navigators we met at the very beginning of our journey. The relationship between Fijian and Tongan is particularly close. Close enough that speakers of the two languages can recognize patterns and echoes in each other's speech, even if full mutual comprehension is beyond reach. It is the linguistic equivalent of family resemblance, two cousins who grew up in different countries, who look different and sound different, but in whose faces you can see the same ancestor looking back. Across the Fijian archipelago, the language fractures into numerous regional dialects, different islands, different valleys, different communities, each with their own particular way of bending the shared tongue. A Fijian from the highlands of Viti Levu and a Fijian from the outer islands of the Lau group, far to the east, might find each other's speech unfamiliar in places, even as they share the same fundamental linguistic inheritance. Languages, like people, adapt to the places they live in. They take on the color of their surroundings. The people who speak this language number approximately 930,000, making Fiji one of the larger Pacific Island nations, though still a small country by any global measure. The majority live on Viti Levu, concentrated around the capital Suva on the wet southeastern coast, and around Nodi on the drier western side, where the international airport sits and where most visitors first set foot on Fijian soil. Suva is a city of genuine character, compact and slightly worn at the edges, as port cities often are, its streets sloping down toward a harbor that is busy with inter-island ferries and fishing boats and the occasional large vessel passing through. The Central Market is one of the finest in the Pacific, a rambling, colorful, fragrant place where you can find everything from fresh taro and cassava to imported spices to the kind of fabric that takes your breath away with its color. It rains in Suva frequently. The southeastern trade winds push their moisture against the mountains above the city and the clouds release it generously. And the city has a particular quality in the rain, its greens intensified, its streets reflecting the gray sky in their puddles, its people moving through the wet with an easy cheerfulness that suggests they have long since made their peace with precipitation. But to understand the Fijian people at their most themselves, you need to go not to the city but to the village. The traditional Fijian village is not a relic. It is not a museum exhibit or a tourist reconstruction. It is a living social organism, functioning today according to principles that have their roots in 3,000 years of island life. At its head is the chief, the Turaga Ni Koro, whose authority is both ancient and earned, inherited through lineage but maintained through the respect of the community. Decisions that affect the village are not handed down by the chief as edicts. They are discussed. They are turned over in the community meeting, the gathering in the Bure Ni Meek, the communal house, where voices are heard and consensus is slowly, patiently built. It is a form of governance that the modern world, with its sharp-edged political contests and its winner-takes-all elections, might study with some benefit. The patience required. The willingness to keep talking until everyone has been heard. The understanding that a decision made in genuine consensus is more durable, more legitimate, and ultimately more effective than one imposed by a narrow majority over a resistant minority. The village is also the place where Fijian culture keeps itself alive, where the old knowledge is transmitted, not in classrooms, but in the doing, the weaving, the cooking, the ceremony, the dance especially. Meek, the traditional Fijian performing art, is not entertainment in the way that word is usually understood. It is something older and more essential than entertainment. It is memory made physical. It is history embodied. In the movements of a meek performance, the precise positioning of the hands, the specific rhythms stamped out by the feet, the words of the accompanying songs, the stories of specific ancestors are told, specific events are commemorated, specific values are restated and reaffirmed. Different kinds of meek exist for different occasions and different purposes. There are war dances, the Sibai and the Villa Villarivo, that were once performed before battle, their stomping rhythms and fierce expressions designed to invoke the warrior spirit and intimidate the enemy. There are love songs and lullabies. There are dances that tell the story of a particular chief's great voyage, or a particular community's founding, or the arrival of a spirit in the dreams of an ancestor who lived a dozen generations ago. To watch a meek performance in a Fijian village, not the abbreviated version put on for tourists at the resort, but the real thing, performed in its proper context, with the proper preparation and the proper participants, is to watch a culture remembering itself. The performers are not interpreting something historical. They are carrying it. They are the vessel through which the past moves into the present, and the conduit through which it will pass into the future. Without the meek, without the people who know it and perform it and teach it, that history simply ceases to exist in the living world. There is a weight to that responsibility that the performers carry with visible seriousness, even when, especially when, the dance is joyful. After the meek, there is always food. The lavo is one of the great pleasures of Fijian life, an earth oven dug into the ground, in which stones are heated to an intense temperature by fire, and then food, wrapped in banana leaves, layered carefully into the pit, is placed on the stones, covered over with earth, and left to cook slowly in the retained heat for several hours. What emerges from the lavo is food transformed. The banana leaves impart their own faint green sweetness. The slow cooking breaks down the fibers of the root vegetables, cassava and taro, those staples of the Fijian diet, dense and starchy and sustaining, into something tender and faintly caramelized. The fish, wrapped and steamed in its own moisture, is flaky and delicate and carries the faint perfume of the leaves. The whole thing arrives not with a restaurant's precision but with a communal generosity, heaped on plates or woven baskets, shared around a group, eaten with hands, in the open air. The lavo is not just a cooking method. It is an occasion. Preparing it requires hours of collective effort. The digging, the fire building, the stone heating, the wrapping, the burying, the patient waiting. By the time the food arrives, the preparation itself has been a form of celebration. The eating is simply the final act of something that has been communal from the beginning. In the highlands of Viti Levu's interior, reached by a road that winds up through sugarcane fields and then into the cooler air of the hills, sits a village called Navala. And Navala is something extraordinary in the modern Pacific, a community of several hundred people living almost entirely in traditional Bure structures. Thatched roofs, woven walls, the high-pitched architecture that the rain runs off so efficiently. No concrete, no corrugated iron, no concessions to architectural modernity beyond what the community has decided it needs. The people of Navala have made a collective choice, not a romantic gesture, not a tourist strategy, but a genuine community decision, to maintain their traditional way of building and the way of life that goes with it. The village sits in a valley above the Ba River, the hills around it forested and green, the river visible below, the sound of it audible in the quiet of the afternoon. To visit Navala is to feel the past not as something dead and preserved but as something living. The children running between the Bure, the women weaving on their verandas, the smoke from a cooking fire rising straight up in the still highland air, the chief receiving visitors in the proper way, the kava bowl prepared, the ceremony conducted with a naturalness that makes it clear this is not performance. It is simply how things are done here, how they have always been done, how, if the community has anything to say about it, they will continue to be done. And then there is rugby. If the lavo is the stomach of Fijian culture and the meek is its memory, rugby is perhaps its heartbeat. The sport arrived with the British colonial administration in the late 19th century and was adopted by Fijian men with an enthusiasm that quickly transcended mere recreation. Something in the game, the physicality, the team interdependence, the combination of individual brilliance and collective discipline, suited the Fijian temperament and physique so perfectly that it seemed, within a generation, less like an imported game and more like something the islands had been waiting for. Fiji's population of under 1 million people has produced rugby players of a quality and a frequency that makes larger, richer nations blink with disbelief. The particular genius of Fijian rugby is visible and unmistakable, an instinctive, improvisational quality, a willingness to attempt the unexpected, a kind of joyful athleticism that makes watching a Fijian team at its best feel less like watching a sport and more like watching a form of play so elevated it becomes something close to art. In the sevens format, the fast, 7-player version of the game, Fiji has been the dominant force in world rugby for decades. 3 Rugby World Cup Sevens titles. And then, at the 2016 Olympics in Rio de Janeiro, when Rugby Sevens returned to the Olympic program for the first time in 92 years, Fiji won the gold medal, defeating Great Britain in the final. In the country's first ever Olympic gold medal in any sport. The scenes in Fiji that night, and in the days that followed, have been described by those who were there as unlike anything they had experienced in a lifetime of following sport. Streets full of people. Churches opened for spontaneous services of thanksgiving. A small island nation of under 1 million souls, on the other side of the world from the stadium where their young men had just stood on the top step of the podium, celebrating with a completeness and a joy that had no performance in it whatsoever. Pure, uncontained, Fijian to its core, Beulah Vinaka, life and goodness. There it was, in its fullest possible expression. The village is very quiet now. The lovo has long since been eaten, the plates cleared away, the banana leaves folded and set aside. The meek is finished, the last stamped rhythm absorbed back into the earth. In the bureau, families are settling for the night. The woven mats cool against the skin, the sound of the river somewhere below, the highland air carrying just the faintest edge of coolness after the warmth of the day. Beulah. Someone said it to you today, on this island, and they meant it with their whole heart. Life. They wished you life. And it was the most natural thing in the world, as natural as breathing, as natural as the trade wind moving through the palm fronds, as natural as the reef breathing in the dark water offshore. Take that word with you into sleep tonight. Let it settle somewhere deep and quiet inside you. Beulah. Life. We are moving now toward the outer edges of these islands, toward the smaller, quieter places. The islands within the islands. The places where the reef meets the open sea and the world becomes very simple and very blue. The Mamanuca Islands are waiting. The Yasawa chain stretches north like a string of green beads dropped across the water. And on those outer islands, the pace of everything slows to something so gentle it is barely distinguishable from stillness. Rest now. Let the current carry you outward, softly, into the blue. The current is carrying you outward now, very gently, very slowly, away from the shore, away from the village fires and the sound of voices, out through the reef passage where the water deepens from turquoise to green to a blue so profound it has no name in ordinary language. The stars are extraordinary out here, further from any light, further from any human noise, and they are reflected in the water around you so completely that you cannot quite tell, in this soft darkness, where the ocean ends and the sky begins. You are floating between worlds. Let your body be completely still. Let your breathing be slow and deep and entirely effortless. There is no distance left to travel tonight. Only this, the open water, the stars, and ahead of you, rising slowly from the darkness, the outer islands of Fiji. They are waiting quietly, the way islands always wait. Patient, self-contained, complete. The first ones you reach are small. The Mamanuca Islands lie just off the western coast of Viti Levu, approximately 20 islands, some of them little more than a sandbar with a palm tree, sitting so low in the water that from a distance they seem to be floating on the surface rather than rising from it. The water around them is shallow and extraordinarily clear, and the colors it produces, turquoise fading to aquamarine fading to the deep blue of the passage between islands, are colors that make first-time visitors reach instinctively for their cameras, knowing even as they do so that no photograph will quite capture what their eyes are actually receiving. But the Mamanucas carry a quiet gravity beneath their beauty. Many of these low-lying islands sit barely above sea level. Some, in recent decades, have begun to lose ground, literally. The rising ocean, driven by the warming of the planet, has been quietly claiming the edges of these islands. Not dramatically, not all at once, but persistently. A little more beach gone each cyclone season. A little more of the garden underwater at high tide. A well that used to be fresh now tasting of salt. Communities that have lived on these particular pieces of land for generations, watching the land itself diminish beneath their feet. The Mamanucas are among the most visible reminders, in all the world, of what climate change means when it arrives not as a statistic or a projection but as the actual, daily, lived experience of real people in real places. The people of these islands did not create the problem that is consuming their shores. They produced a vanishingly small fraction of the carbon that is warming the ocean that is eating their beaches. And yet they are among the first to pay the price. They are still there, still fishing the same lagoons, still maintaining the same community structures, still saying Beulah to strangers with a warmth that has not been diminished by any of it. That particular form of grace, continuing to offer welcome from a disappearing shore, is something the world would do well to notice. Beyond the Mamanucas, the islands change character. The Yasawa chain stretches northwest from the Mamanuca group in a long, dramatic line. Approximately 20 volcanic islands running for roughly 80 kilometers, their profiles utterly different from the flat, gentle Mamanucas. These are steep islands, rugged islands, islands where the volcanic rock drops almost vertically into the water, where the cliffs are dark and ancient and the vegetation clings to them with a tenacity that speaks of long adaptation to difficult conditions. And around the base of those cliffs, where the rock meets the sea, the water is a color that stops rational thought. It is the blue of the Yasawas that people remember. Not just blue, not the blue of postcards or the blue of ordinary tropical water, but a blue that seems to generate its own light. A luminous, almost electric blue-green that shifts and deepens and brightens as the light changes through the day, and that at midday, in the shallow lagoons, becomes so vivid it seems almost artificial, as though someone has colored it. The specific conditions that produce this color are white sand on the seafloor, reflecting light upward, shallow water, thin enough for that reflected light to reach the surface, and the particular angle and intensity of Pacific sunlight. Together, they create an optical phenomenon that has no real parallel anywhere on Earth, or has it in very few places, and none quite like this. The world came to know this color through film. The famous Blue Lagoon, made twice, in 1949 and again in 1980, was filmed in the Yasawas, near an island called Nanuya Layview. The filmmakers came because they needed a place of impossible beauty for their story, and found, in that particular lagoon on that particular island, exactly what they were looking for. The world watched, and wanted to know where it was, and Fiji's outer islands began their slow emergence into the global imagination. Far to the east, further than most visitors ever go, further than the regular ferry routes reach, lies the most remote part of the Fijian archipelago, the Lau Group. Approximately 100 islands, scattered across the Eastern Ocean, most of them tiny, many of them uninhabited. The Lau Group sits closer to Tonga than to Suva, and that geographical fact is reflected in everything about the place. The culture of Lau is not straightforwardly Fijian. It has been shaped, over many centuries of contact and intermarriage and trade, by the Tongan influence that has always flowed in from the east. The people of Lao look slightly different from Western Fijians. Their traditions differ in subtle ways. Their connection to Tonga is not historical abstraction. It is living family, living memory. The Lao group is the crossroads of two great Pacific cultures, and the people who live there carry both inheritances with a pride that makes no apology for its complexity. They are Fijian, and they are something else as well, something that the Lao Islands made, over centuries, out of the meeting of East and West across that blue expanse of water. To reach the Lao group requires commitment, a long ferry journey, or a small charter flight, or the kind of sailing voyage that the Lapita people would have recognized. But those who make the journey find something that the more accessible islands cannot quite offer. A quietness so complete it feels like a physical substance. The absence of tourist infrastructure. The presence, undiluted, of a way of life that the modern world has not yet substantially reached. Back to the north and west, between the two great islands of Viti Levu and Vanua Levu, lies a smaller island that carries one of the most extraordinary concentrations of natural beauty in all of Fiji. Taveuni, the Garden Island. The name is earned. Taveuni receives so much rainfall, caught by its central ridge from the moisture-laden trade winds, that its interior is among the most lushly vegetated places in the Pacific. Waterfalls everywhere. Rivers running clear and fast through forest so dense and so green that the light filtering down through the canopy takes on a quality that is almost liquid. Bird species found nowhere else. Plant communities of extraordinary complexity. And one flower found nowhere else on Earth. The Tajamorsha grows only in one place in the world, around the crater lake of Lake Tajamorsha, high on the ridgeline of Taveuni, at an altitude where the clouds hang low and the air is cool and the lake lies still and dark in its ancient volcanic bowl. The flower itself is a cascade of red and white, clusters of small blooms falling in delicate arching sprays, red petals cupped around a white interior, impossibly delicate for a flower that grows in such dramatic, cloud-wrapped circumstances. There is a Fijian legend attached to the Tajamorsha, as there should be, for a flower this beautiful. It tells of a young girl who climbed the mountain fleeing from her parents and became caught in the vines near the crater lake, and whose tears, falling into the lake, became the flowers. It is the kind of story that a people tell about something they recognize as precious and fragile and irreplaceable, something that needs a story around it to hold it safe. The Tajamorsha is Fiji's national flower, and it grows in exactly one place, under exactly one set of conditions, on exactly one island. A reminder that beauty, at its most extraordinary, is always also specific, always also fragile. In the narrow strait of water between Taveuni and the southern coast of Vanua Levu, something waits beneath the surface that has made experienced divers, people who have dived the Great Barrier Reef and the Red Sea and the Coral Triangle, stop and simply run out of words. It is called the Rainbow Reef. And within the Rainbow Reef, there is one particular section that carries its own name, because it deserves one. The Great White Wall. It is a near-vertical face of reef that drops from a shallow ledge into the deep blue of the Somosomo Strait, a wall of living coral that plunges downward for 60, 70, 80 meters before the light fails and the details disappear into darkness. And on this wall, in the particular conditions of current and depth and nutrient richness that this strait provides, soft white coral grows in such density and such profusion that the entire wall appears to be covered in snow. Not in the metaphorical way. In the way that makes you float in front of it and genuinely struggle to process what your eyes are telling you. A vertical snowfall, frozen in place, dropping into the abyss. Divers drift down the wall slowly, exhaling bubbles that rise in silver spirals toward the distant surface, and the white coral passes on either side like a dream of winter in the middle of a warm Pacific Ocean. Occasional fish, antheas in their thousands, clouds of them, orange and pink, drift through the white like sparks carried by a slow wind. There are places on this earth whose beauty exists at a scale that the human mind cannot fully accommodate, places that are simply larger than our capacity to comprehend them. The Great White Wall is one of those places. You experience it, and you carry something of it away with you, but the fullness of it remains in the water. It stays where it belongs. Far to the north of the main archipelago, 650 kilometers away, more distant than a different country, a small island sits alone in the ocean. Rotuma. Administratively, Rotuma is part of Fiji. But culturally, and linguistically, and in its own fierce sense of itself, Rotuma is something separate. Its people are Polynesian in heritage and tradition, more closely related to the cultures of Tuvalu and Samoa than to the Melanesian Fijians of the main islands. They speak their own language, Rotuman, which belongs to an entirely separate language family from Itauke Fijian. Their customs, their ceremonies, their way of organizing social life, all of it is distinctly, proudly Rotuman. The island sits in isolation that is difficult to fully imagine. 650 kilometers of open ocean in every direction. A small volcanic island, green and hilly, its cliffs dropping to a reef, its interior farmed in the old way. A community of a few thousand people, many of them represented, at any given time, by members of the family living in Suva or Auckland or Los Angeles, sending money home, keeping the connection alive across the distance. Rotuma is one of those places that exists at the edge of the world, the kind of place where the news arrives late and the silence between one thing and the next is long enough to hear the ocean in. Its people are among the most culturally self-possessed in the entire Pacific, certain of who they are, unhurried in the expression of it, carrying their separateness not as isolation but as dignity. And then the weather. Because Fiji is not only beauty and warmth and the blue of lagoons. It is also the Pacific in its full, unmoderated power. The islands sit within the Ring of Fire, that great arc of seismic and volcanic activity that circles the Pacific Basin, and they experience the Earth's restlessness in the form of regular tremors, the occasional more significant shake, the reminder that the ground beneath these islands is not as settled as it appears. But the most dramatic expression of the Pacific's power over Fiji comes from the sky. Cyclones. Between November and April, when the ocean is at its warmest, the conditions are right for the formation of tropical cyclones, vast rotating systems of wind and rain that build over the open ocean and track across the archipelago with an indifference to human structures that is absolute. Fijian communities have always lived with cyclone risk, have always built and rebuilt, have always developed the particular psychological resilience of people who know that the weather can take everything and that after it does, you begin again. But in February of 2016, the cyclone season produced something unprecedented. Cyclone Winston crossed the Fijian Islands as the most powerful tropical cyclone ever recorded in the southern hemisphere. Its wind gusts reached 325 kilometers per hour. Not a misprint. 325 kilometers per hour, winds moving faster than a racing car on a straight road, winds that reduced solid concrete structures to rubble, that stripped the vegetation from entire hillsides down to bare soil, that pushed a wall of ocean water across low-lying islands with a force that cannot be adequately described in ordinary language. Winston killed 44 people. It destroyed or severely damaged over 40,000 homes. It tore through some of the most beautiful and most vulnerable communities in the archipelago and left behind a landscape that looked, in the satellite images taken in the days after, as though something had simply erased the green and left only brown. And then, the Fijian people began to rebuild. Village by village, family by family, with the same communal instinct, the kerakir, the deep collective impulse, that has always carried them through the worst of things. International aid arrived. The government deployed resources. But the real work of rebuilding was done by communities helping communities, neighbors helping neighbors, the ancient social structures of Fijian life proving, once again, to be more resilient than anything the modern world had built to replace them. Within months, the green was returning to the hillsides. Within a year, rebuilt villages were standing. The reef, given time and protection, was beginning to recover. And here, perhaps, is the most extraordinary fact of this entire long night. In study after study, in survey after survey of global human well-being and life satisfaction, the Fijian people rank among the happiest in the world. Not the wealthiest, not the most materially secure, not the best insulated from the forces, climate change, seismic risk, cyclone, political instability, that have tested and continue to test these islands. Among the happiest, the researchers who investigate these findings come back with the same answers. Community, the depth and durability of social connection. The kava bowl passed around the circle and the 2 hours spent in genuine unhurried conversation that it occasions. The Beulah called across the street to a stranger, and meant. The kerakir, the instinct to share rather than accumulate, to give when asked, to trust that the giving will be reciprocated. The meek that carries the ancestors into the present. The lovo that turns the feeding of a community into a ceremony of gratitude. The reef, for those who live beside it, maintained and protected as a living inheritance to be passed to children and grandchildren. These are not complicated things. They are not expensive things. They are not things that require a particular level of technology or development or economic sophistication. They are simply the things that humans need: connection, belonging, purpose, beauty, the sense of being part of something larger than oneself. And they are the things that Fijian culture, in its long, complex, sometimes painful, always extraordinary history, has found its own particular way of providing. 3,500 years of people on these islands, working out how to live well. And the answer they arrived at was, together. The outer islands are very quiet now. The Yasawa chain is a line of dark shapes against the stars to the northwest, the water between them perfectly still. On the reef, the polyps are feeding in the darkness, their tiny lives continuing without interruption, the calcium carbonate accumulating grain by grain. Somewhere near Tavuni, in the mountain cloud, the Tajamorsha is sleeping, its red and white flowers closed for the night, waiting for the morning light. In the Lao group, on an island whose name only its own people know well, a fire is burning on the beach. Someone is awake. Someone is sitting with the fire and the ocean and the stars, the way humans have always sat with fire and ocean and stars, since the first night a person sat still long enough to notice how beautiful the world was. And on every inhabited island in this archipelago, in the villages and the towns, in the Bure and the modern houses, in Suva and in Navala and on the shrinking shores of the Mamanukas and in the highlands above the Ba River, people are sleeping. 3,500 years of accumulated human life, held gently in the dark. Beulah, they wish you life. And as this long, warm, extraordinary night comes slowly, softly to its close, as the images of reefs and village fires and the Great White Wall and the Tajimarsha flower and the faces of people saying Beulah, always Beulah, begin to dissolve into the deeper darkness of genuine sleep, carry that wish with you. Life. Goodness. The world is worth exploring, even as you sleep. And you have explored it tonight, all of it, from the first Lapita canoe coming through the reef passage 3,500 years ago to the fire burning on the Lao beach right now. And you have found it to be, in all its complexity and beauty and fragility and resilience, worth every moment of attention you gave it. The reef is breathing. The trade wind is moving very gently through the palms. The stars are reflected in the water. And somewhere, on a warm Pacific shore, someone is saying your name in the only language that has ever mattered. Beulah Vinaka. Life and goodness. Sleep now. Sleep.